Chapter 3, The Forgetter's Sermon. The hollow smelled of old grief. That was the first thing newcomers noticed the smell. Not incense, not mineral, not the sulfurous bite of the lower stratosphere that clung to everything in Holloway. It was something older and more intimate than any of those. Salt and singed fabric, warm stone where hands had pressed in the dark, the specific staleness of rooms where people had wept repeatedly and in private. The hollow was a natural cavity in Holloway's underbelly, widened over decades by the slow erosion of gravity tides, and its walls held the residue of 1,000 surrendered lives the way old wood held smoke. Tonight it held 300 people. They stood close, shoulders touching, some gripping each other's forearms in the way that people do when they are afraid to stand alone. Candles had been replaced here by phosphor strips salvaged from decommissioned sky barges, and they cast a bluish, underwater light across the crowd. No one spoke. The silence was total except for the deep bass vibration that ran through Holloway's stone when the gravity tide was low, a sound you felt in the jaw rather than the ears, a planetary heartbeat, steady and indifferent. Then Curran stepped onto the dais. He emerged from behind a fall of dark cloth, unhurried, and the crowd's breathing changed. Not gasps, nothing so dramatic, just a slight collective deepening, as though the room had drawn more air to sustain itself. He was not tall. That always surprised newcomers. They had heard the voice before they saw the body filtered through recordings, skimmed across the Undercity on humming frequencies, and the voice suggested a bigger man. But Curran stood at ordinary height, lean, wearing the same unbleached gray fabric as his followers. That was deliberate, and they all knew it, and knowing it didn't diminish the effect. He stood still for a long moment. Let them look. The dais beneath him was the only extravagance in the entire hollow. It was built from layers of crushed crystal dust compacted into slabs, sealed with resin, and it caught the phosphor light and scattered it in ways that ordinary stone wouldn't. Blues and near whites, and occasionally, if you watched long enough, the faintest ghost of gold threading through the surface like a vein of something buried alive. People who had been inside the unburdened long enough knew that the crystal dust came from shattered memory cores. That was the point. Every step Curran took on that dais, he walked on what other people had chosen to release.
"You're tired,"
he said, not loudly. That was the thing about his voice in person, it was not large. It was close. It found the ear the way a finger finds a bruise, with precise and inevitable pressure.
"I know you're tired because you've been carrying something since before you knew what carrying felt like. Some of you have been carrying it since you were small enough to fit under a table. Some of you picked it up later, when someone you loved handed it to you as they were leaving. Some of you made it yourself, in a moment you can't stop returning to. A moment that replays without your permission at 2 in the morning when the tides run low, and the island shifts and you can't pretend sleep is still possible."
He began to move. Not packing, he had too much discipline for packing. Walking, slowly, from one side of the dais to the other, and his eyes moved across the crowd the way light moves across water.
"Memory,"
he said.
"We are told it is sacred. The Mnemosyne Council places it in buildings of glass and stone. The mnemonologists crystallize it and lock it in cold cases, as if preserving the wound preserves the person, as if the scar is the same thing as the skin."
A ripple through the crowd. Not disagreement. Something that felt more like recognition, the specific discomfort of being accurately described.
"They call it identity. They tell you that without your memories, you are not yourself. That to forget is to die."
He paused, tilted his head slightly.
"Have any of you considered that they may have it exactly backwards?"
In the front row, a woman in her 50s was weeping without sound. She had a crystal in her hand, pressed hard against her sternum, and it was the dark orange red of old iron, old anger, old shame. She'd been holding it for a very long time. Her knuckles had gone pale. Curran looked at her, held the look for just long enough that she knew he'd seen her.
"There is a man I knew,"
he continued, addressing the whole room but not releasing her,
"who could not pass a doorway without seeing his son. Dead 12 years. The boy had learned to walk in that house, and his father could not stop watching him do it over and over, every morning at the hallway threshold. He called this love.
A beat.
He had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 12 years. He had not eaten a meal without apologizing to the air. He called this grief. I call it captivity.
We call it captivity,
Said a voice in the crowd. Then others. Not rehearsed, or if it was rehearsed, rehearsal had made it feel genuine, which was perhaps the same thing. Curran held up his hand. Not for silence, they were already quiet. For weight, for gravity.
You are not your worst day. You are not the moment when someone left, or was taken, or chose to go. You are not the decision you made in a corridor 5 years ago when you were frightened and didn't know better. That moment is crystallized. It is inert. It is not alive, but it lives in you as if it has blood of its own, as if it has a right to the space behind your eyes.
He stopped walking. He stood at the center of the dais and looked directly forward, and even those at the room's far edges had the impression he was looking directly at them.
What would you be?
He said.
If you set it down.
The silence lasted long enough to become something physical, pressing on the eardrums like depth pressure. Near the back, a young man raised his fist, a crystal held inside it, and the crystal was the gray-green of bile, of nausea, of something witnessed that cannot be made not witnessed. He raised it toward the shallow stone basin at the front of the room. He shook. His jaw was tight. He had come 3 times before and stood here and not been able to do it. Others watched. No one urged him. He brought his arm down and the crystal broke against the stone. The sound it made was very small. A click and then a faint ringing, the way struck glass rings, dissolving. The smell that came from it was fast and localized petrol and a child's shampoo, lavender and something burnt, and then it dispersed, pulled apart by the hollow's slow circulation of air, and was gone. The young man stood very still. His face did not relax. Something moved across it, more difficult to name than relaxation, something like the expression of a person who has put down a piece of luggage in a station and is not yet sure if they will pick it back up. Others came forward. Not a rush. One by one, then 2 together, a couple holding hands and moving to the basin and breaking what they'd brought with them. The sounds accumulated. The smell shifted and layered roses over rust, burned meat below something sweeter, cedar, old paper, the specific warm smell of skin at close range. Cascade risk was real when too many broke at once, but Curran had studied it carefully. 300 people releasing carefully distributed shards in a space this size, with this air circulation, with the followers who'd been through before stationed at intervals to absorb the edges of any resonance, it was manageable. He had calibrated it. He had done this 43 times in the last 8 months, and he knew exactly how much grief a room could shed before the walls started to echo it back. He watched. He stood on the dais, and he watched them come and give and stand and sway slightly and look confused and look emptied and look, a few of them genuinely lighter, the way a face looks lighter after a fever breaks, surprised by its own ease. This was real. He was not performing this belief. He watched them, and something in his chest that was usually very dense and knotted permitted, for a moment, the smallest loosening. He caught himself, tightened it back. In the 3rd row, a man named Severin had not moved. He'd been among the first to arrive and had stood through the sermon with the particular stillness of someone doing enormous work. He was holding 2 crystals, not one. Both hands. The one in his right hand was familiar red-orange, anger or shame, common. The one in his left was different. It was almost white, chalky, with a faint interior luminescence that pulsed very slowly. Memory that had been kept too long, compressed beyond what the lattice could hold. He stepped forward. He shattered both at once, one in each hand, bringing them down on the rim of the basin in a single crossing motion. The sound was twice as large. The smell that bloomed was nothing Curran had calibrated for. It was specific and enormous. A kitchen in full summer, onions and fat and something sweet baking, and over it all the high clean smell of a child's hair after a bath. Just that, simple and devastating, and it expanded outward in a sphere that reached the first 3 rows and the walls on either side. Severin made a sound that was not language. He pitched sideways. Not fainted, not collapsed pitched, like a building whose foundation has been selectively removed from one side. The woman in the front row caught his arm by reflex and went down with him. Around them, 4 or 5 others pressed their palms over their eyes or mouths, their bodies convulsing with involuntary sensation, someone laughing without meaning to, someone else bent double making the sounds of crying with no tears. A follower with medical training was moving already, had moved before Severin hit the floor, was kneeling with 2 fingers at his throat and a small blue light from a battered monitor at his wrist. Curran descended from the dais, unhurried. This, too, was deliberate. Panic in a leader travels faster than cascade recall. He crouched beside Severin. The man's eyes were open and tracking, but slowly, moving across the ceiling as if reading something written there. His breathing was present. His cheeks were wet, and had been for some time, and the wetness had traced tracks down his temples and into his hair.
He's in it.
Said the follower with the monitor.
Too much at once, he'll surface.
He'll surface.
Curran said. He said it for the people watching, the ring of frightened faces around them. Severin's hands on the floor were loose and open, the way hands only go in sleep or shock.
Give him room.
The crowd stepped back. Curran looked at Severin's open hands, looked at the pale dust of 2 shattered crystals on his palms already dispersing. He stood. His face was composed, and everyone who looked at it would later say, when asked, that he had been steady, that he had been certain. The mark of a leader, certainty in the room in the moment, regardless of anything prior. He returned to the dais. He could feel the mood of the room, still fragile, still tilting.
That,
He said,
is what it costs, and I will not tell you the cost is small.
His voice was very quiet now, and the room had to hold its breath to catch him.
But Severin held those 2 crystals for 11 years. And in 11 years, every version of himself that might have grown in their place, every joy, every future morning, every possibility of rest, was crowded out. The pain took the space. The pain lived in his house, and ate at his table and slept in his bed, and he paid for all of it.
He let them sit with that.
Severin is on the floor tonight. Tomorrow he will get up, and the weight he carried for 11 years will not be there.
He pressed one hand briefly, lightly, against his own sternum, a gesture that felt private, involuntary, which it was.
How long have you been paying for yours?
In the back of the hollow, very near the draped entrance, a figure had been standing very still. One of the newcomers, anonymous in Holloway's borrowed gray, watching. But Curran's eyes traveled the room as they always did, accounting for edges and corners, and they stopped briefly on this person. He noted the posture, the way they stood slightly apart from the people beside them, the quality of stillness that was different from grief stillness, different from overwhelmed stillness, the stillness of someone cataloging. He filed it, returned his gaze to the rest of the room. The phosphor strips hummed. The gravity tide ran low, and the island's heartbeat moved through stone and crystal dust, and the soles of 300 pairs of feet. Severin breathed on the floor, and his hands stayed open. The passage behind the dais was not on any map of Holloway that the council had ever commissioned. It was a narrow throat of stone, barely shoulder width, and the walls were close enough that Curran could feel the temperature of them without touching. Cold on the left where bare rock met the stratospheric exterior. Warmer on the right where the hollow's residual heat still reached through old stone. He had walked this passage 43 times, and he had never once used a light. He knew it by shoulder width and by the change in air pressure at the bend, and by the particular sound his own footsteps made when the floor shifted from natural rock to the compressed crystal dust slabs he'd laid himself 3 years ago, before anyone else had walked here. The chambers at the end were 3 in number, each sealed by a door made of salvaged barge hull plating. His private rooms. The first held a cot, a basin, a change of gray cloth. The second held his instruments. The third held nothing anyone else had seen. He entered the second room and sat on the low stool at the center and waited. The waiting was the habit of a man who knew how to use stillness the way other men used speech. Pava would be 2 minutes behind him, maybe 3. She always stopped to speak with whoever was on medical watch after a session, always gathered the post-sermon frequency readings from the wall sensors, always folded everything into a summary so compact and precise that it occupied less than 30 seconds of speaking time. She was 26. and had been with the Unburdened for 19 months, and was by considerable measure the most competent person in Holloway, which was why she knew things he had not yet told his lieutenants. He heard the passage before he heard her. The change in airflow at the bend, the half-second compression. Then the door opened. Pava closed it behind her. She was small, dark-haired, wearing the same gray as everyone else, and the only distinguishing thing about her appearance was the instrument slung across her back in a worn canvas case, a resonance reader, custom-built, calibrated to frequencies too subtle for standard equipment. She had built it herself from components she'd scavenged before she found the Unburdened. Before Curran had found her, more precisely.
Severin is stable,
She said.
Full surface should be complete by morning.
I know.
He had known before he left the hollow.
What else?
She set the canvas case on the table and began unbuckling it. Her movements were efficient, unhurried. She had her own version of stillness.
Attendance was up 11 from last week, 8 newcomers. One of them I flagged, posture was wrong, too controlled for someone genuinely distressed, standing near the back entrance.
I saw.
You want me to identify them?
Not yet.
He watched her hands on the equipment.
What did the session readings look like?
Clean. Good distributed release. Cascade risk peaked at 40% when Severin broke both at once and resolved inside a minute. The circulation held.
She drew the reader from its case and set it on the table. It was roughly the size and shape of a small suitcase, the casing dinged and mismatched from its components' separate origins, but the display panel in its center was precise and clean. She powered it on. The display warmed to a faint amber.
There's something else.
He waited. She did not make him wait long. Pava didn't perform. That was another thing he valued about her.
This came in during the second half of the sermon. I didn't want to interrupt.
She slid a data chip from her breast pocket and fed it into the reader's port.
Resonance sweep from the underbelly harvest zone. Standard automated collection. But the sweep flagged something before the session started, and I pulled the print myself to verify before bringing it to you.
The display shifted. A frequency map resolved, the kind that looked to an untrained eye like whether contour lines and density clusters, overlapping waves in false color. To a trained eye, to his eye, it was a voice, or the ghost of one. The structural signature of a particular consciousness, the way it had arranged itself in memory, the specific shape of a self. He looked at it. He looked at it for longer than he intended to. His voice came out level.
Where was this recovered?
Kalora's underbelly. Waste layer, storm shed material from the last 2 nights of tidewind.
Pava was watching the display, not him.
Whoever had it was in the harvest zone during the early morning hours. Small-scale scavenger, probably solo. The sweep only caught the print because the crystal was still warm when the collector drone passed over.
Still warm.
Gold crystals ran warm. He had known that for 5 years. He had spent 5 years working around it.
Gold-toned resonance.
Pava confirmed.
Partial, fragmented. But the signature...
She paused, and the pause was the first imprecise thing she had done since entering the room.
I cross-referenced it against our archive flags. It matched a preserved pattern in the deep vault. The match rate was high, 87%.
Curran's hands were on his knees. He pressed the weight of them down, into his own legs, and felt the pressure and kept his face as it was.
87.
He said,
I've never seen a random shard run that high on a match. The highest I've pulled on an incidental recover is 63. 63 on a sibling pair, which is about as close as these signatures get.
She turned from the display and looked at him now. She was very good at reading rooms, Pava, and she read this one carefully.
You know this signature.
Not a question. He stood. He crossed to the display and looked at the frequency map from closer, the way you do when you already know what you're seeing and are buying yourself time to decide what to do with that knowledge. The contour lines were familiar the way a voice heard through a wall is familiar. Not complete, not clear, but unmistakable to someone who had spent months learning every node and interval of it. He had learned it in guilt, in the small hours of mornings that tasted of failure, going back to the archive again and again to verify that what he'd stored was still there, still intact, still held together by the lattice he'd built to contain it. Still her.
Whose crystal did the scavenger find?
He said.
We don't know yet. We only have the print. The scout who pulled the sweep data gave me this.
She reached into the same breast pocket and produced a second chip, smaller.
Visual capture from the drone. Partial. Weather interference.
She fed it in. The display split. On the left, the frequency map. On the right, a gray and degraded image from a Harvest Zone drone, shot from below, aimed upward at the underside of Kaelora during storm-shed conditions. Wind distortion, crystal debris in the frame, the whole image shuddering at intervals with gravity eddies. But in one corner, briefly, a figure. Clinging to the underbelly's rigging by hand and foot, the posture of long practice, a canvas satchel slung across one side. Young. Small. Moving with the fast, specific efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they were going.
The scavenger.
Pava said. He studied the figure.
Have we seen them in Holloway before?
Not through any of our formal processes. Informal, possible.
She was watching him again.
They could have resold the crystal. Already gone. But if the stone was still warm when the drone passed, they'd had it less than 4 hours. That's fast, even for experienced scavengers. It means they either knew what it was,
Or they could feel it.
Curran said. He hadn't meant to say that. Pava was quiet for a moment.
gold resonance responds to compatible frequencies.
She said carefully.
A sensitive handler would feel warmth, possibly a mild somatic echo. Basic touch sensitivity.
Or they resonate.
Curran said.
Properly, without relief.
The room was very still. The deep bass of the gravity tide ran through the stone floor and through the legs of the stool and through everything.
That's theoretically possible.
Pava said. Her voice had gone smaller.
That would make them extremely unusual.
Yes.
He turned from the display. He walked to the far wall and stood with his back to it and looked at the room rather than at her, the whole room at once, the instrument table and the salvaged equipment and the frequency map with its ghost lines.
Pull everything you can on unregistered scavengers operating out of Kaelora's underbelly. Recent. Last 3 months. Cross it with any flagged touch sensitivity reports from the waste layer. Any anomalous resonance readings the Kaeloran surveyors logged as equipment error.
That's a substantial search.
Yes.
There are protocols with the Kaeloran Registry Office. If we go through official channels.
Don't go through official channels.
His voice did not rise, but it shifted in timbre, the way it had on the dais when he'd said the word captivity, something that came from somewhere lower and more settled.
I need this quiet, Pava. The scavenger, the crystal, the print. Nobody outside this room knows what the signature matches.
She looked at him.
My scout knows the print was anomalous.
An anomalous is not the same as identified. Keep it that way.
Another pause. She was weighing something. He appreciated that she weighed things rather than simply acquiescing, even when it cost him a few seconds.
All right.
She said.
But if the crystal is already in circulation.
It's not.
He said it with more certainty than he had earned. Then, because she deserved precision and he owed her that much.
If the scavenger can resonate with it, they won't sell it. A stone that warm, that responsive, they'll want to understand what they have.
That could make them more dangerous. Not less.
It makes them findable.
He pushed off the wall.
Someone who resonates without reliving doesn't release what they hold. They keep it. They go back to it.
He moved back to the table and looked at the drone image again. The figure on the rigging, already pulling away from frame.
We go back to what we can't let go of. Every one of us.
Pava said nothing for a moment.
I'll start the search tonight.
Before morning.
She nodded. Her hand moved to the reader to begin pulling it back into its case, then stopped. She looked at the frequency map still burning on the left side of the display.
Kieran.
She said his name with the particular flatness of someone about to say something they'd been deciding whether to say for the last several minutes.
If this signature is what the match rate suggests it is, if whoever is in that archive is still coherent, still
She chose her next word carefully.
still someone, what happens to the unweaving?
The question landed in the room and stayed there. He answered it the same way he answered the hard questions in the hollow, with steadiness that came from a different place than certainty.
The unweaving is the work.
He said,
It doesn't change.
Even if
It doesn't change.
He picked up the data chip from the reader's port and held it. The chip was thin, almost weightless. Nothing about it felt like what it contained.
Get me the scavenger's name by dawn.
Pava read the end of the conversation in his posture and did not push further. She finished packing the reader with the same efficient movements she'd used to unpack it, buckled the canvas case, swung it onto her back. At the door she stopped, as she always did when she had a final item.
the flag newcomer in the hollow. You said not yet on identification. Do you want me to revisit that?
Curran was still looking at the data chip in his hand.
Tomorrow.
He said. She left. The door sealed, and the passage sounds of her departure faded, and the room held only the gravity tide's deep vibration and the amber light of the reader's display, which he had not powered off. He stood very still. The frequency map was still visible, the ghost contours of a consciousness he had last touched in a panicked half-hour 5 years ago, his hands shaking over instruments he barely understood, trying to hold together something that was already flying apart. He had caught most of it, 87% apparently. He had told himself for 5 years that this was almost everything. He hadn't let himself look too directly at the other 13. His thumb moved over the edge of the data chip. He set it down on the table, carefully, beside the reader. Then he pressed his fingertips to the table's surface and bent his head and breathed. What comes loose does not simply disappear. He knew that. He had built his entire movement on a lie that was also a truth, and the truth was, shedding memory was real and relief was real and the lightning was genuine. And the lie was that the shed thing was gone. It wasn't gone. It went somewhere. Sometimes it scattered on the stratospheric wind, and sometimes it settled in the underbelly of an adjacent island, and sometimes a child with quick hands and an unusual nervous system picked it up in a storm. He lifted his head. He looked at the frequency map.
I know.
He said quietly, to nobody. To the ghost lines on the display, the structural echo of a self he had failed to save and had never stopped trying to hold together.
I know.
He reached out and powered off the display. The room went back to ordinary dim, and the gravity tide moved through the floor, and somewhere in the passage behind him, the stone breathed cold air, and Curran stood alone in his private chamber with a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years sitting in his chest like a crystal that had been kept too long, dense and pale and full of compressed light that had nowhere to go. He straightened. He moved to the door. By dawn, he would have a name.